It all begins with a question that shakes the very foundation of the British monarchy. What if Meghan Markle's path to royalty didn't start with Prince Harry? What if it started decades before, long before the cameras, the tabloids, or the fairy tale wedding everyone watched unfold? Imagine a world where ambition, strategy, and desire collided so perfectly that the outcome seemed inevitable. This is the story Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, has stepped forward to tell. A story that has Buckingham Palace in shock and left the United Kingdom grappling with questions it never expected to ask. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Thomas sits quietly in his home, an ocean of memories pressing down around him. He recalls a young Meghan, a girl who smiled with charm and wit, but whose eyes seemed to look beyond the ordinary, beyond Hollywood, beyond simple dreams of fame. She talked, according to Thomas, not of fleeting success or fleeting popularity, but of a life intertwined with history, protocol, and the unshakable allure of royalty. He describes conversations that took place years ago, emails sent in moments of youthful fantasy, diaries scribbled late at night with careful thought, and private musings shared with friends and confidants who didn't yet realize they were hearing the early blueprints of a royal strategy. Many would call it ambition. Some might call it fantasy. But Thomas insists these weren't mere daydreams. They were detailed, deliberate, and deeply strategic. He remembers a particular diary entry, written in her teenage years, where Meghan laid out what she called the perfect life, a high-profile partner, global influence, and the subtle, often invisible power that comes from association with the crown. He shudders as he recalls reading it years later, realizing that what had seemed innocent curiosity was anything but. It was a map, drawn in the quiet moments of youth, leading directly to the palace gates. You might wonder how much of this is true. How much is simply a father's perspective tinted with hindsight and perhaps disappointment? Thomas himself admits the conflict. He loves his daughter. He always has. But the emails and diaries, he says, speak for themselves. In one exchange, Meghan allegedly discusses attending high society events with influential people, as though she were calculating steps on a chessboard. Another diary passage describes an imagined conversation with a future royal, detailing the perfect introduction, the charm she would need, the appearance she would cultivate. It's not merely imagination, Thomas says. It's a plan. This revelation is not just scandalous, it's explosive. It challenges the narrative the public has been sold for years. Meghan, the outsider, the American actress who swept into the heart of British royalty, may have been much more calculating than anyone realized. And the implications reach beyond Meghan herself. Prince Harry, the royal many thought was a willing participant in a fairy tale romance, may have been, in Thomas's view, an unwitting piece in a long-standing ambition. Could a young woman's meticulous planning really shape the life of one of the most scrutinized princes in modern history? Thomas believes it could, and he is ready to lay out the evidence that he claims proves it. But why now? Why step forward after years of silence? Thomas's reasoning is as personal as it is public. He fears for his daughter's image, for the truth behind the curated stories of romance, charity, and Hollywood glamour. He worries that the palace itself has not fully understood the patterns he has observed. And perhaps most importantly, he wants the world to see Meghan not only as a beloved duchess, but as the ambitious strategist he believes she has always been. The timing, according to Thomas, is critical. With the couple frequently in the spotlight, with ongoing projects, interviews, and public appearances, the patterns he has seen unfold over decades are now undeniable, he says, and the world deserves to know. Even as Thomas prepares to expose these details, he is haunted by contradictions. He remembers Meghan as a loving, protective daughter, but also as a fiercely determined woman whose drive could overshadow sentiment. He reflects on moments when ambition seemed to guide her decisions more than family loyalty. And yet, he cannot ignore the love he feels or the instincts of a father trying to reconcile the daughter he raised with the woman he now watches navigating global power and influence. As the world begins to hear whispers of Thomas's revelations, reactions are intense. The media, ever eager for a new angle on royal life, picks up on the story immediately. Headlines speculate about secret diaries, strategic plotting, and long-term ambitions. Commentators ask whether this is simply a father trying to assert his narrative or whether it reflects deeper truths about Meghan's rise to prominence. Fans and critics alike are drawn into the swirl of conjecture, opinions, and emerging evidence. The palace, predictably, remains silent publicly, but sources close to Buckingham are reportedly unsettled. The idea that a member of the royal family's inner circle, or someone connected through marriage, might have been part of a strategic personal blueprint decades in the making challenges centuries of tradition and perception. For Thomas, the proof is in the details. He recalls emails where Meghan allegedly outlined ambitions to attend events frequented by the royal family. Diary entries describe conversations and imagined scenarios that, to him, reveal intent far beyond simple curiosity. Even casual remarks, once thought innocent, are now, in retrospect, part of a carefully crafted mosaic. Each piece adds to the story he is telling the world. A story of foresight, ambition, and a carefully charted rise that may have begun long before Harry even entered the picture. And yet, Thomas's exposé is not merely an attack. He frames it as a revelation, an insight into human ambition and the pressures of living under public scrutiny. He questions, provocatively, whether the public should reconsider the fairy tale narrative they have been told. How much of what we see is shaped by genuine affection, and how much is influenced by careful planning, foresight, and strategy? The line between love and ambition is often blurred, he argues, and the world deserves to understand that complexity. Now, as the United Kingdom grapples with these claims, a nation watches, fascinated and divided. Royal commentators debate the implications. Social media ignites with speculation. Tabloids publish every available detail. And amidst it all, Thomas continues to insist that the emails and diaries are authentic, that they reveal a side of Meghan Markle the public has never seen, and that Buckingham Palace, long a symbol of tradition and protocol, is unprepared for the storm these revelations may bring. The stakes are high. Love, ambition, and family intersect in ways that can shock even the most seasoned royal observers. The introduction of this evidence, Thomas believes, will force the public, the media, and the palace to confront questions that have been lurking for years. How much of Meghan's rise was strategic? Was Harry a willing participant, or a target of an ambitious plan? And ultimately, what does this mean for the future of the royal family itself? And just when it seems the story has reached its first peak, Thomas drops a line that stops even seasoned journalists in their tracks. What I'm about to show you will change how the world sees Meghan and Harry forever. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if you stumbled upon secrets that could shake the world? Thomas Markle faced exactly that. One ordinary afternoon, he was cleaning out old boxes in his home when something unusual caught his eye. A stack of folders, yellowed with age, tucked behind a pile of forgotten photographs. Most people might have tossed them aside. But Thomas, sensing that these were not ordinary keepsakes, paused. As he opened the first folder, the faint scent of old paper mixed with dust hit him. And then he saw it. Handwritten diaries, emails printed long ago, and notes scrawled in the margins of day planners. The entries were startling. They weren't typical teenage musings or casual journal reflections. Each line hinted at careful calculation, foresight, and, at times, a palpable sense of destiny. Meghan, according to Thomas, had been thinking about the royal family for years, long before Harry entered her life. He remembers flipping through an email in particular, sent in what he recalls as her early 20s, where Meghan discussed attending exclusive events frequented by members of the British elite. She wrote about appearances, conversations, and impressions as though scripting her life for maximum impact. Thomas recalls reading the diary entries with a mix of awe and disbelief. Some passages detailed imaginary conversations with future royal acquaintances. Others laid out what she considered the perfect path to prominence, a high-profile partner, public recognition, and opportunities that would solidify her status. In one line, she apparently wrote, "One day, I will belong where history is made." At the time, Thomas thought it was a young woman dreaming. But now, looking back, every detail seemed deliberate, every ambition carefully mapped. As he dug deeper, Thomas realized that these weren't random thoughts. They were pieces of a meticulous plan. He describes an entry where Meghan made note of potential friends, social circles, and events, as though she were studying a game board. It wasn't about acting alone, he says. It was about positioning herself strategically in a world that demanded charm, intelligence, and a certain social finesse. The diary revealed someone who was acutely aware of power dynamics and who understood how influence could be cultivated over time. Emails corroborated the diaries. One message, from a friend in the industry, mentioned Meghan's excitement about meeting influential people at a charity gala. In her reply, Meghan allegedly detailed who she hoped to speak to, what impression she wanted to leave, and even suggested hypothetical scenarios where her interactions might lead to bigger opportunities. Thomas reflects on this email with lingering disbelief. He writes that the tone wasn't boastful. It was precise, almost clinical. It demonstrated an understanding of social maneuvering most people only learn after decades in business or politics. But it wasn't just the planning that shocked Thomas. It was the audacity behind it. He recalls a diary entry from her late teens, describing an ideal future that involved a relationship with someone deeply embedded in tradition, protocol, and historical significance. The words leap off the page. I will be prepared. I will understand the rules. And when the time comes, I will step into my role fully aware of what is expected. It is this combination of foresight and determination that Thomas believes distinguishes Meghan's ambition from mere fantasy. He admits, though, that the discovery was emotionally complicated. On one hand, he felt proud. His daughter was intelligent, resourceful, and remarkably capable. On the other hand, he was unsettled by what appeared to be a premeditated path toward a life in which personal relationships, even love, might intersect with calculated ambition. He remembers thinking, could a young woman really plan her future with such precision, especially one involving a member of the royal family? And if so, what did that mean for the people around her, friends, colleagues, and especially Prince Harry? Thomas also noticed subtle patterns. References to style, presentation, and even wardrobe choices appeared repeatedly. These were not casual musings. He recalls one note where Meghan described attending a gala with elegance, poise, and discretion, showing respect for tradition while leaving a lasting impression. Even the language seemed intentionally crafted. Thomas reflects that it was as if she were scripting not just her actions, but the perception of her actions. Every appearance, every smile, every handshake was potentially a calculated move in a broader strategy. The emotional weight of the discovery was compounded by the timing. Thomas realized that he held documents that could drastically alter public perception of Meghan, a woman who by then had already married Prince Harry and become a global figure. Every page he turned presented a moral dilemma. To reveal these findings was to expose a private past, yet to remain silent was to let what he saw as a carefully constructed narrative continue unchecked. He recalls asking himself repeatedly, what is the right course of action? Protect my daughter? Protect the truth? Or does the truth demand exposure, regardless of consequence? As Thomas sifted through the materials, he noticed inconsistencies in public portrayals versus private writings. Publicly, Meghan appeared spontaneous, romantic, and driven by personal passion. Privately, she had documented plans, strategies, and deliberate steps that suggested a vision shaped with care and precision. Thomas recalls feeling a jolt, a contradiction that he could not ignore. How much of the public narrative was real, and how much was orchestrated long before the cameras and media attention? He also reflects on his role as a father. How do you reconcile pride with concern? Love with caution? He recounts moments of laughter reading playful passages, only to be struck moments later by the strategic undertones behind the words. It was as if he were reading two people at once, the daughter he knew intimately and the ambitious figure she had long been cultivating for the world stage. The duality was dizzying, and Thomas admits it left him feeling conflicted. Thomas began cataloging the findings meticulously. He created folders for emails, diary entries, and miscellaneous notes. Each item was time-stamped, contextualized, and cross-referenced with public events and media coverage. He wanted to ensure that when these revelations came to light, they would tell a coherent, undeniable story. And what emerged was striking, a pattern of foresight, ambition, and strategic engagement that seemed to predate Harry's appearance in Meghan's life. But as Thomas delved deeper, the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden in a folder labeled innocuously as personal thoughts, he found a series of notes that suggested Meghan had considered the ideal partner, the social positioning, and even the exact qualities that would make someone compatible with her long-term vision. Thomas writes that reading these entries felt like uncovering a playbook. Every interaction, every move, appeared intentional, part of a plan years in the making. And in that moment, Thomas realized the magnitude of what he held. These were not casual reminiscences. They were a detailed, strategic blueprint for a future intertwined with royalty. The implications were enormous. For Meghan, for Harry, for the palace, and for the public perception of a couple whose love story had been celebrated worldwide. As Thomas looked over the final folder, he paused. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed on him like a storm about to break. He knew that revealing these documents could ignite controversy, fracture relationships, and rewrite the narrative of Meghan Markle's life. Yet he also understood that the world deserved to know what he had discovered. The emails, the diaries, the notes, all pointed to a reality far more calculated than anyone could have imagined. And then, tucked between two diary pages, he found it. A single note, brief yet chilling in its clarity. It hinted at a plan so audacious that it could redefine the public's understanding of Meghan's path to royalty. Thomas's hands shook as he read it. He knew immediately that this was the piece that would shock Buckingham Palace to its core. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered when ambition first sparks in someone's life? Is it in a fleeting childhood daydream, a casual observation, or a quiet moment of determination no one else notices? For Meghan Markle, according to Thomas Markle, it was long before the red carpets, long before Hollywood lights, and far before any thoughts of Prince Harry. He recalls a young Meghan, a girl whose imagination stretched beyond her suburban neighborhood, whose eyes seemed to always look toward a life larger than her own. Thomas describes moments from her early teens when Meghan would disappear into books about royalty. Not just biographies, but detailed histories of queens, duchesses, and royal families from around the world. She would linger over descriptions of coronations, etiquette, and palace protocol, asking questions about the inner workings of royal households. To most observers, this might have seemed like ordinary curiosity. To Thomas, it was a window into an extraordinary focus. He remembers her commenting on the grace with which princesses carried themselves, on the importance of image, perception, and influence. It fascinated her, Thomas recalls, how a single moment, a smile, or a gesture could change history, or at least the public perception of it. Even in casual conversations, Meghan allegedly hinted at aspirations that went beyond acting or fame. In one instance, Thomas recounts, Meghan discussed attending galas and charity events not just for networking, but as an opportunity to be noticed by people in positions of power. She imagined conversations, rehearsed questions in her mind, and thought strategically about how to present herself. Thomas was struck by the precision of her thoughts, the foresight that seemed unusual for a teenager. Could a young girl really be this calculated? Or was it simply an early form of practice for the world she would later step into? School plays, family gatherings, and even simple social events became exercises in observation. Thomas recalls Meghan paying close attention to how people responded to certain behaviors, how attention shifted based on charm, elegance, or wit. She would later analyze these interactions in her diary, writing notes about what impressed her and what didn't. Her friends, according to Thomas, often noticed this curiosity but didn't understand its depth. Meghan's interest wasn't superficial, it was analytical. She dissected interactions like a chess player studying a board, anticipating moves before they happened. What's more, Thomas found that Meghan's fascination with royalty was often intertwined with imaginative exercises. She would write fictional letters to members of the royal family, sometimes creating entire scenarios in which she interacted with them. At first glance, these might appear as playful writing exercises. But Thomas insists that the content revealed consistent attention to detail, protocol, etiquette, appearance, and even how to handle potential challenges. She considered contingencies, consequences, and impressions, all of which suggested a level of strategic thinking beyond her years. Family friends reportedly observed Meghan asking questions that were not typical for her age. Why do they wear certain crowns? How do they make decisions in private? Why do they have to smile at people they don't know? These questions, Thomas notes, were more than curiosity. They were the seeds of understanding power dynamics. They foreshadowed an adult who could navigate complex social structures with ease, someone who could position herself to gain influence while maintaining the appearance of charm and grace. Thomas also remembers a pivotal moment when Meghan, around age 14, attended a family wedding. She was fascinated by the elegance of formal attire, the hierarchy of guests, and the subtle power dynamics playing out in conversations and seating arrangements. She made detailed notes afterward in her diary, not about her enjoyment of the event, but about what she observed, who commanded attention, how introductions were made, and which gestures carried the most weight. Thomas recalls reading these notes later and realizing that Meghan was already training herself for the kind of world she wanted to enter. Even holidays and vacations offered opportunities for observation. When traveling to different cities or attending high-profile events, Meghan would study local social customs, etiquette, and the nuances of interactions among influential people. Thomas notes that she was particularly attentive to the subtleties of conversation, how tone, posture, and timing could affect perception. She was learning the unspoken rules of society, long before anyone would call it networking or strategy. But it wasn't all meticulous planning and observation. There were moments of play, of youthful fantasy, that Thomas believes were also part of her growing ambition. Meghan would imagine herself in royal scenarios, sometimes out loud, sometimes in private writing. She wrote about attending state dinners, hosting important figures, and even participating in ceremonial events. These were not mere daydreams. They were exercises in visualization, in rehearsing the life she desired. Thomas reflects that this early practice may have honed her skills in presentation, diplomacy, and interpersonal strategy, skills that would later become invaluable. What strikes Thomas most is the consistency of these interests over time. It wasn't a fleeting obsession or a passing phase. From early adolescence through her teenage years, Meghan's fascination with royalty, influence, and strategic social positioning persisted. Every book read, every event attended, every diary entry penned seemed to reinforce a larger vision she had for her life. Thomas notes that even her early ambitions contained the hallmarks of careful planning, foresight, adaptability, and an understanding of how to shape perceptions. He also recalls a subtle but telling pattern. Meghan often contrasted her ambitions with her awareness of limitations. She wrote about barriers, geography, social status, public perception, and explored strategies to overcome them. She imagined hypothetical conversations where she could impress, persuade, or charm influential figures, and she evaluated the likelihood of success. According to Thomas, this demonstrated not just ambition, but a sophisticated ability to plan strategically, anticipate challenges, and navigate complex social landscapes. Friends and acquaintances occasionally noticed this side of her. Some admired it, others found it puzzling. But few recognized the full scope of what Thomas was later able to uncover. It wasn't just a dream of marrying into royalty. It was an intricate understanding of how to reach positions of influence, combined with a personal drive that would not be easily deterred. Thomas reflects on how this early ambition may have shaped Meghan's choices in the years that followed. Every decision, from career moves to social engagements, seems to reflect a calculated understanding of opportunities and timing. Even her early acting career, in which she pursued roles and networking opportunities that maximized exposure, can be seen through the lens of someone practicing the skills of influence she had been honing since childhood. And yet, there is an emotional undertone that Thomas cannot ignore. As a father, he felt both pride and unease. Pride in witnessing his daughter's intellect and ambition, but unease at the realization that these qualities, so remarkable, could be interpreted as manipulative or strategic in ways that others might not understand. He wrestled with the duality of wanting to protect her while also recognizing the patterns that could have far-reaching consequences. It is this mixture of admiration, concern, and revelation that sets the stage for what comes next. Thomas's later discoveries, emails, diaries, and personal notes, would build upon this foundation of early ambition, revealing not only foresight and planning, but a pattern of strategic thinking that spanned years, culminating in a rise that many have described as meteoric, but which Thomas views as deliberate. And just when it seems that we have glimpsed the early blueprint of Meghan's ambitions, A discovery emerges from her teenage diaries that leaves Thomas momentarily speechless. A reference to an ideal partner, someone who embodied qualities that could align perfectly with her vision. A line that hints at a calculated future where love and ambition intersect. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. How does a young woman take the lessons of her childhood ambitions and turn them into real-world strategy? For Meghan Markle, according to Thomas Markle, Hollywood was more than a stage for acting. It was a proving ground, a training arena where charm, connections, and calculated moves could propel her closer to the life she had been envisioning since her teenage years. Thomas recalls watching Meghan step into Los Angeles with a combination of determination and awareness that was remarkable. The city is unforgiving, he notes, full of dreamers and opportunists, yet she navigated it with precision. Every audition, every networking event, every social gathering was more than an opportunity for career advancement. It was a chance to study people, understand influence, and practice the skills that would later serve her in far more high-profile arenas. He remembers her attending industry parties not just to be seen, but to analyze dynamics. Who commanded attention, who influenced decisions behind the scenes, who held power subtly yet unmistakably. Thomas notes that Meghan would later reference these moments in emails and diary entries, describing encounters with actors, directors, producers, and even philanthropists, always reflecting on how connections could translate into bigger opportunities. She evaluated conversations, gestures, and the smallest details, treating them as strategic exercises. Even her career choices, Thomas says, were deliberate. She selected roles that gave visibility, but also allowed her to demonstrate poise, intelligence, and versatility. A small recurring part on a television series wasn't just a stepping stone. It was a calculated move to appear relatable yet influential, capable yet composed. Every role, every public appearance, was like a chess move, placing her closer to a position where opportunity and visibility intersected. But the strategy wasn't always obvious to those around her. Friends and colleagues often saw Meghan as charming, witty, and personable, someone who genuinely connected with others. Yet Thomas points out the duality. Her warmth coexisted with careful observation and reflection. She was learning to read people, anticipate reactions, and manage impressions, all under the guise of friendliness. This balance, he says, is what allowed her to thrive in Hollywood's competitive social hierarchy, while simultaneously honing the skills she would later employ in royal circles. Networking, according to Thomas, became an art form for Meghan. She developed relationships with individuals who could influence her path, not overtly manipulative, but thoughtful in her approach. She remembered names, preferences, and patterns of behavior. She followed up thoughtfully, often leaving lasting impressions that seemed effortless to outsiders. In her diary entries from this period, she reflected on these encounters, noting what worked, what didn't, and how she could improve. Thomas likens this period to a rehearsal for the palace, a place where every gesture, every introduction, and every social nuance had meaning. Yet there was more than just strategy at play, there was also timing. Thomas recalls Meghan observing the rhythm of opportunities, when to step forward, when to remain in the background, when to make her presence known in ways that would maximize impact. In one diary entry, she described attending a high-profile gala where the timing of her conversation with a senior industry figure could influence her visibility for months to come. Thomas emphasizes that this wasn't mere luck. It was foresight, cultivated over years of study, observation, and reflection. Social media, too, became a tool. Thomas notes that Meghan was adept at managing her image online, presenting herself as approachable yet ambitious, relatable yet aspirational. Posts were crafted carefully, sometimes reflecting personal milestones, sometimes highlighting professional achievements. Each message, photo, or comment was an extension of her larger strategy, a way to cultivate influence while remaining in control of the narrative. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her Hollywood years was the way she blended ambition with authenticity. Thomas reflects that Meghan's charm, her natural charisma, wit, and empathy was genuine, yet it also served a purpose. She could engage people on a human level while subtly steering interactions toward strategic outcomes. It was this combination of authenticity and calculation that allowed her to gain trust, build networks, and position herself in a way that few noticed until it was too late. During this period, Thomas recalls, Meghan also began considering long-term personal relationships in the context of her ambitions. She wrote in her diary about qualities she admired in partners: empathy, influence, visibility, and the capacity to complement her trajectory. Even casual interactions with colleagues or acquaintances were analyzed in light of these criteria. Thomas notes that this foresight may have foreshadowed her eventual meeting with Prince Harry, though at the time it would have seemed entirely coincidental. There were challenges, of course. Hollywood is ruthless, and Meghan faced rejection, criticism, and setbacks like anyone else. But Thomas emphasizes how she turned these obstacles into lessons. She would reflect on failed auditions or disappointing outcomes in her diary, noting what could be learned and how strategies could be adjusted. Resilience became part of her toolkit, along with charm, observation, and foresight. Every disappointment was a step toward refining her approach, making her sharper, more aware, and more prepared for larger stages. Friends occasionally commented on her focus, noting that Meghan seemed to have a long-term vision few could articulate. She spoke about her goals in a way that was both relatable and aspirational, yet always contained a subtle layer of strategy. Thomas recalls thinking that even then, she was blending ambition with authenticity, a balance that would later become her defining skill. And then there were the social calculations, subtle but important. Thomas recalls one instance where Meghan attended a charity event filled with influential figures. She observed seating arrangements, conversation patterns, and how introductions were handled. Later, in her diary, she reflected on how the dynamics could be leveraged for future opportunities. Thomas emphasizes that this level of analysis, especially for a young woman in her early 20s, demonstrates a strategic mind trained to navigate complex social landscapes. Amid all this, Thomas admits, there were moments of genuine enjoyment. Meghan loved acting, storytelling, and creative expression. She built friendships, formed collaborations, and experienced the highs and lows of Hollywood life. But underlying these experiences was an awareness of the larger picture. A vision she had been developing since childhood, now being refined and tested in the real world. Every interaction, every choice, every connection was a step toward an eventual goal, even if the goal was not yet fully realized. Emails from this period, which Thomas later discovered, reveal that she was conscious of her public persona and the impressions she left on others. One exchange with a colleague discusses attending a high-profile charity function and making an impression on attendees who could later influence her career. Thomas points out that while most young actors focus on roles or immediate opportunities, Meghan was already thinking about how visibility, networking, and impression management could converge to shape her future. And then, according to Thomas, the most pivotal moment of this Hollywood phase emerged, the trip that would lead her directly to Prince Harry. He recalls diary entries describing meetings, social events, and chance encounters that seemed coincidental at the time, but, in retrospect, fit seamlessly into a broader pattern of calculated positioning. She noted interactions, evaluated impressions, and documented outcomes, all as though rehearsing for the next stage in her life. This is where the personal intersects with the strategic. Thomas emphasizes that while Meghan's Hollywood years were filled with ambition and calculation, they also set the stage for relationships that would become highly public and deeply scrutinized. The skills she honed, networking, observation, timing, impression management, would later be applied not just professionally but personally, in ways that few outside her inner circle could recognize at the time. And just as Thomas began to realize the full scope of her strategy, he discovered a set of emails that confirmed something astonishing. Meghan's Hollywood networking was not random. Every move, every connection, every high-profile engagement was subtly aligned with her vision for the future, a vision that would one day place her at the heart of one of the world's most prominent royal families. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered whether a chance encounter is truly chance, or whether it's the result of careful positioning, subtle timing, and an almost uncanny sense of opportunity? Thomas Markle certainly wondered this when he began piecing together the timeline of Meghan's early ambitions and her eventual meeting with Prince Harry. What seemed to the world like fate, a romance that captured headlines and hearts, may, according to Thomas, have roots that trace back years to a girl who meticulously planned her path long before the cameras rolled. Thomas recalls hearing stories of Meghan's first meetings with Harry, the initial sparks, the smiles, the public images of instant connection. But behind the scenes, he insists, there was far more at play. He discovered diary entries and emails from that period in which Meghan reflected not only on the excitement of meeting someone new, but also on the qualities she sought in a partner. She wrote about charm, discretion, and visibility, traits that would later align perfectly with Harry's public and private persona. One diary entry Thomas cites details her thought process leading up to a social event where Harry would be present. It's almost eerie in its specificity. Timing, placement, interactions, all carefully considered. She describes the room, the people she expects to meet, the impression she wants to leave. Thomas says that, reading this later, he realized that these weren't just musings. They were rehearsal notes for a real-world encounter that would alter the course of her life. Thomas admits that part of him wants to question whether this interpretation is fair. Was it ambition, or was it instinct, luck, timing? But then he reads the emails where Meghan discusses her excitement about interacting with key people and carefully strategizes conversational topics. It becomes hard to dismiss the idea that her approach was more deliberate than coincidental. Every step, every gesture, every word seemed calibrated to leave a lasting impression. Friends and acquaintances from that period describe Meghan as poised, charming, and deeply intelligent. Thomas emphasizes that while these qualities were genuine, they were also tools, extensions of the skills she had been developing since adolescence and refined throughout her Hollywood career. She could connect effortlessly, make people feel valued, and yet subtly guide interactions toward outcomes she envisioned. In other words, she had learned the art of influence, long before anyone called it that. Thomas notes that Harry himself seemed to fit seamlessly into the scenario she had imagined years earlier. In diary entries, she describes ideal qualities for a partner: empathy, visibility, influence, and a willingness to embrace public scrutiny. Reading these passages, Thomas was struck by how closely Harry's personality and circumstances aligned with the attributes she had outlined. The coincidence seemed almost too perfect. Was this chance, or was it a culmination of long-term observation and planning? Emails from this period reveal Meghan analyzing interactions in minute detail. She discusses tone, body language, and subtle cues, documenting what worked and what didn't. Thomas recalls a particular entry where she reflected on Harry's responses to her questions and comments, noting the way he listened, reacted, and engaged. She appeared to be measuring compatibility, not just on a personal level, but also in terms of long-term vision and alignment with the life she had been mapping out since her teenage years. The public narrative presented a whirlwind romance, filled with fairy tale imagery, media coverage, and global fascination. But Thomas insists that behind the scenes, there was a different story. A story of observation, analysis, and subtle maneuvering. He emphasizes that this is not to suggest deception or malice, but rather a calculated understanding of how relationships, influence, and opportunity intersect in the real world. Thomas also reflects on the emotional complexity of this period. He admits that it is difficult to reconcile pride, concern, and admiration. Pride, because Meghan had grown into a confident, intelligent, and ambitious woman. Concern, because the strategic mindset he observed might have implications for those closest to her. Admiration, because the foresight and discipline she displayed were remarkable. The diary entries, emails, and personal notes all convey a depth of thought and intentionality that few could match. Moreover, Thomas highlights subtle hints of adaptability in Meghan's reflections. She was aware of public perception and media scrutiny, even in early encounters. She documented potential narratives, anticipated reactions, and considered how to navigate both praise and criticism. Thomas sees this as evidence of a sophisticated understanding of influence. The ability to engage genuinely while managing perception, a skill that would later be essential in her interactions with the royal family and the global media. There were also contradictory elements that fascinated Thomas. While Meghan displayed strategic calculation, she also expressed genuine excitement, curiosity, and affection. She wrote about shared laughter, moments of connection, and the thrill of discovery in getting to know someone new. Thomas emphasizes that this duality, Ambition intertwined with authenticity is part of what made her so compelling. It allowed her to build relationships that were emotionally resonant while also strategically advantageous. Some might argue that Thomas's interpretation is colored by hindsight, that reading old emails and diary entries through the lens of later events could exaggerate intentionality. But Thomas points out that the level of detail, specificity, and consistency across years is difficult to ignore. He cites multiple entries where Meghan reflects on social dynamics, timing, and interpersonal strategy in ways that align uncannily with how her relationship with Harry developed publicly. Thomas also recalls emails in which Meghan describes interactions with Harry's family, noting his relationships with siblings, his public appearances, and the expectations surrounding royal life. Even in these early reflections, she appears attuned not only to Harry as an individual, but also to the broader social and institutional context he inhabits. Thomas sees this as further evidence that her approach was deliberate, informed by a long-standing understanding of influence, visibility, and social navigation. Friends from that time recount how Meghan would sometimes analyze conversations, revisiting them in later discussions or diary entries. She would assess what she learned, what could be applied to future interactions, and how she might position herself to create opportunities. Thomas emphasizes that this was not obsession. It was a disciplined, consistent pattern of strategic thinking that had been honed since her teenage years and refined throughout her Hollywood career. As the relationship progressed, Thomas notes, Meghan's skill in managing perception became more pronounced. She balanced warmth and authenticity with careful attention to image, timing, and impression. Every public appearance, private conversation, and interaction seemed to be navigated with an awareness of both immediate impact and long-term implications. Thomas saw this as a natural extension of the strategic skills she had developed over years, now applied in a personal and highly visible context. And then there were the diary entries that hint at her thought process during key moments. First meetings, casual interactions, and significant events where Harry was present. Thomas recalls one entry where she describes analyzing his responses to both her questions and the environment around them. She notes subtle cues, behavioral patterns, and moments that could indicate compatibility or alignment with her broader vision. Reading these passages, Thomas felt a mixture of awe and unease. The depth of observation and the clarity of intention were extraordinary. Finally, as Thomas pored over the materials, one particularly striking note emerged. In it, Meghan reflects on the ideal timing and circumstances for her next steps, both professionally and personally. The precision of her thinking, the foresight in considering outcomes, and the awareness of opportunity all pointed to a pattern, a trajectory carefully charted, culminating in the moment she met Harry. Thomas describes feeling a chill, realizing that what the public saw as a spontaneous romance may have been the result of years of preparation and strategic thinking. And as he closed the folder, Thomas could not shake the gravity of what he had uncovered. The childhood ambitions, Hollywood maneuvering, and strategic insight all converged in a single moment, the meeting with Harry. To Thomas, it was no longer a simple love story. It was the unfolding of a plan that had been decades in the making, executed with precision, patience, and remarkable awareness. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when love and ambition collide? Can a relationship exist purely on emotion, or does strategy sometimes sneak in beneath the surface, subtle and almost invisible? Thomas Markle believes that in the early days of Meghan and Harry's relationship, both forces were at play, a delicate dance of personal connection and calculated positioning, and a convergence that would soon draw the attention of the world's most scrutinizing institution, Buckingham Palace. Thomas recalls watching the evolution of their relationship with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and awe. To outsiders, it appeared like a typical whirlwind romance, filled with charm, laughter, and the occasional awkward moment that made headlines. But Thomas insists there was more beneath the surface. According to his diaries, emails, and reflections, Meghan had long honed the skills of observation, perception management, and strategic engagement. These skills were now subtly woven into her interactions with Harry. From the earliest encounters, Thomas notes, Meghan displayed an awareness of Harry's personality, his family dynamics, and the pressures of public life. She noticed how he responded to attention, how he interacted with friends and aides, and how he balanced personal vulnerability with public expectation. In diary entries, she described moments where she adjusted her approach, not inauthentically, she claimed, but strategically, to maintain harmony while subtly guiding conversations and impressions. Thomas emphasizes that this is not to suggest manipulation in a sinister sense. He reflects on moments of genuine warmth, laughter, and intimacy that were undeniably real. But alongside these moments, Meghan appeared conscious of timing, tone, and impact, hallmarks of the strategic thinking she had cultivated since childhood and refined through her Hollywood years. Every gesture, every compliment, and every carefully chosen word seemed to be both authentic and purposefully considered. Friends recall Meghan asking questions that revealed both curiosity and awareness. She would inquire about Harry's experiences, his expectations of marriage, and the pressures of royal life. But in her diary entries, she also reflected on these conversations, noting opportunities, potential obstacles, and ways to navigate them. Thomas explains that this duality, genuine engagement paired with strategic reflection, is what allowed her to build rapport, trust, and alignment with Harry, while maintaining control over the trajectory of their relationship. Emails discovered by Thomas illustrate a striking pattern. Meghan would discuss meetings, social events, and interactions with Harry in a way that demonstrated foresight. She considered how each encounter might influence his perception of her, the impression left on his inner circle, and even potential ripple effects for public perception. Thomas writes that these messages reveal a meticulous mind, blending affection, empathy, and careful analysis, a combination that, in his view, foreshadowed her eventual integration into royal life. The early relationship was also marked by contradictions that Thomas finds fascinating. On one hand, Meghan is portrayed in public as spontaneous, emotional, and romantic. On the other hand, the diaries and emails suggest forethought, planning, and an acute awareness of long-term consequences. Thomas reflects on the tension between these narratives, wondering how much of what the world witnessed was shaped by authentic emotion and how much was guided by subtle strategy. Thomas recalls specific instances where Meghan's awareness of power dynamics became apparent. During gatherings with mutual friends or charitable events, she would observe hierarchies, note influence, and assess opportunities for alignment. She was not overtly calculating in a way that seemed manipulative, he says. Rather, it was an extension of the skills she had developed over years, skills that allowed her to navigate complex social structures, anticipate reactions, and foster relationships that were mutually beneficial yet aligned with her long-term goals. The diaries also reveal her reflections on Harry's own patterns. She noted his temperament, his responses to media scrutiny, and his familial obligations. She evaluated how these factors might influence both their private interactions and public image. Thomas points out that her analysis was consistent with the strategic thinking she had displayed throughout her life, from childhood fascination with royalty to her Hollywood networking. It was both a continuation of her methodical approach and a demonstration of adaptability, adjusting strategy in real time based on new information. Emotional spikes in the diaries reveal the complexity of feelings interwoven with strategy. Meghan wrote candidly about moments of joy, frustration, and vulnerability. She expressed excitement about shared experiences, genuine affection for Harry, and moments of uncertainty. Thomas believes this emotional authenticity enhanced the effectiveness of her strategic thinking, allowing her to connect deeply while maintaining awareness of outcomes. The combination of intellect and emotion created a relationship dynamic that was both compelling and resilient. Thomas also highlights subtle indications of how Meghan anticipated the impact of public scrutiny. In emails, she discussed potential media narratives, the reactions of royal aides, and ways to manage perception without compromising authenticity. She analyzed possible scenarios, including misinterpretation of gestures or statements, and considered strategies to maintain harmony while asserting presence. Thomas interprets these insights as evidence of foresight, an understanding of influence and visibility that was remarkably sophisticated. Friends and confidants from that period noticed her thoughtfulness, but few realized the depth of her strategic awareness. She was admired for her charm, intelligence, and warmth, Yet Thomas notes that beneath the surface, she was continuously evaluating circumstances, refining approaches, and anticipating consequences. This duality allowed her to maintain relationships that were emotionally real while subtly guiding interactions toward outcomes aligned with her vision. Thomas also recalls moments where family tension surfaced, particularly with relatives concerned about the pace and intensity of the relationship. Meghan, he says, navigated these situations with tact, balancing honesty and diplomacy while maintaining alignment with her personal goals. She was aware of perception, how family, friends, and ultimately the public would interpret her actions, and she acted accordingly. These reflections, documented in emails and diary entries, underscore the level of consciousness and intentionality she brought to the relationship. Even casual interactions with Harry's inner circle were subject to subtle observation. Thomas cites entries where Meghan documented conversations with siblings, aides, and family friends, analyzing how dynamics shifted based on tone, content, and context. She noted what impressed, what irritated, and what could be leveraged to foster connection and alignment. Thomas emphasizes that while these reflections were strategic, they were also grounded in genuine care and interest in building meaningful relationships. The juxtaposition of personal affection and strategic awareness defines much of the early relationship dynamics. Thomas writes that Meghan's approach allowed her to navigate potential obstacles with grace, maintain emotional connection, and ensure alignment with long-term objectives. It was this balance, he argues, that made the relationship both resilient and highly visible, ultimately positioning both Meghan and Harry to enter the global spotlight together. And yet, as Thomas reviewed these documents, he discovered a pattern that would shock even the most seasoned observers. Within the diaries and emails were entries that suggested not only alignment and compatibility, but also premeditated steps to navigate the complexities of royal life, influence, and public perception. Meghan seemed to anticipate challenges before they arose, positioning herself in ways that maintained authenticity while subtly managing outcomes. It became clear to Thomas that the early days of the relationship were more than a romance. They were the unfolding of a meticulously developed dynamic, a combination of genuine emotion, foresight, and strategy, executed with precision. Every shared laugh, every intimate conversation, every public appearance was layered with both authenticity and careful consideration. And just as Thomas began to realize the full implications of these early dynamics, he uncovered a note that would redefine his understanding of the relationship. A private observation Meghan had made about how Harry's reactions aligned with the qualities she had long identified as essential in a partner. A note suggesting that what appeared to the world as love at first sight may have been the culmination of years of planning and preparation. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what a life looks like through the pages of private diaries and the unseen trails of old emails? For Thomas Markle, the answer came in waves of revelation, shock, and reluctant awe. These documents, painstakingly preserved over years, were not mere snapshots of fleeting thoughts. They were detailed chronicles of ambition, strategy, and self-reflection. They allowed him to trace Meghan's journey from a young girl with grand dreams to a woman navigating the intricate corridors of influence and power. Thomas begins by recounting the moment he decided to sift through the materials thoroughly. He realized that, individually, each email, diary entry, or note was informative, but together, they formed a narrative so coherent and purposeful that it was almost impossible to ignore. Patterns emerged, recurring themes, repeated strategies, and a consistent awareness of both personal and public consequence. The documents weren't just personal. They were carefully calibrated guides to living in a world where perception often mattered as much as reality. In one of the early diaries, Meghan wrote about attending a high-profile charity gala. On the surface, the entry reads like a typical teenage reflection, observations about dresses, music, and atmosphere. But Thomas noticed the details beneath the surface, notes about key attendees, their interests, and how she might engage them. She even jotted potential conversation starters and ways to make a lasting impression. Thomas describes feeling a shiver at this discovery, realizing that even in adolescence, Meghan was already thinking strategically about social positioning and influence. The emails offered an equally striking perspective. One exchange with a friend detailed Meghan's excitement about a networking opportunity, but what caught Thomas's eye was the precision in her language. She wrote about timing, tone, and approach, evaluating how her actions could shape perceptions. Each word seemed chosen not only for clarity, but for impact. She appeared acutely aware of how small details, body language, choice of words, even timing, could affect outcomes. Thomas notes that this attention to detail would later translate seamlessly into interactions with the royal family and public life. Some diary entries went further, detailing hypothetical conversations with influential figures, including members of British high society. Thomas recalls one particularly revealing passage where Meghan imagined being introduced at a prestigious event, considering how to project confidence, warmth, and intellect simultaneously. She evaluated how different responses might be interpreted and how she could navigate potential missteps. Reading these entries, Thomas says he realized that Meghan's strategic thinking was not a product of recent experience. It was ingrained, cultivated over years, and refined continuously. What makes these revelations even more compelling is the juxtaposition of ambition and introspection. Thomas points out entries where Meghan reflected on her motivations, the ethical dimensions of influence, and the balance between personal goals and relationships. She questioned her own intentions, explored potential moral dilemmas, and sometimes expressed vulnerability. These passages humanize her strategy, showing that ambition, for Meghan, was intertwined with reflection, conscience, and emotional awareness. Emails also reveal a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics. Thomas cites one exchange where Meghan advised a friend on how to navigate a high-pressure networking event. She offered guidance on posture, conversation flow, and making meaningful connections, skills she herself clearly employed in her interactions. Even more telling, she included observations about the psychology of attention, how people interpret subtle gestures, tone, and expressions. Thomas notes that this shows not only awareness, but a deep analytical mindset, capable of translating insight into actionable strategy. Another striking aspect is her ability to anticipate consequences. Diary entries repeatedly demonstrate that Meghan considered both immediate outcomes and long-term implications. She wrote about potential misunderstandings, public perception, and the importance of cultivating relationships carefully. Thomas emphasizes that this foresight is rare, particularly in young adults, and reflects a level of strategic maturity that few could recognize without the context he had. Beyond individual interactions, the diaries and emails reveal an ongoing assessment of her trajectory. Thomas recalls Meghan tracking her progress, evaluating what she had learned from each experience, and adjusting her approach accordingly. She celebrated successes quietly, but documented failures meticulously, analyzing what went wrong and how to improve. This continuous cycle of reflection and adaptation, Thomas notes, is a hallmark of strategic thinking applied over time, a skill that would later define her approach to the intense scrutiny and responsibilities of royal life. Contradictions also emerge in the documents. While Meghan often presented warmth, humor, and authenticity in her reflections, there were also passages of calculated consideration, evaluating influence, and planning interactions. Thomas finds this duality fascinating. It suggests that while Meghan genuinely engaged with people emotionally, she also maintained a level of awareness that allowed her to shape outcomes subtly. This blend of authenticity and calculation, Thomas believes, is what made her both relatable and formidable. Thomas also highlights the emotional dimension captured in the diaries. He recalls passages where Meghan expressed fear, excitement, doubt, and joy. These entries are raw, personal, and deeply human, reminding Thomas that behind the strategic mind was a person experiencing the same spectrum of emotions as anyone else. The combination of emotional depth with foresight and analysis is, in his view, part of what allowed Meghan to navigate complex relationships and high-pressure environments successfully. The emails, meanwhile, offer a glimpse into her communication style. Thomas notes that she consistently used clarity, persuasion, and empathy. She framed ideas carefully, anticipated objections, and subtly guided conversations toward desired outcomes. Even when discussing mundane matters, There was a consistency of thought that reflected long-term practice in both strategy and interpersonal influence. It is this consistency, Thomas emphasizes, that makes the emails so compelling. They are not isolated incidents. They are evidence of a cultivated skill set applied across years and situations. One particularly revealing set of emails focuses on Meghan's reflection after social engagements. She assessed how others responded to her, what impressions were formed, and how she might refine her approach in the future. Thomas points out that such detailed analysis of social dynamics is rare, particularly for someone of her age at the time. It demonstrates a level of self-awareness and strategic foresight that many would not expect, and it foreshadows the precision with which she would later navigate royal life. Another diary entry stands out in Thomas's memory. It describes a hypothetical scenario in which Meghan interacts with someone of influence, considering multiple outcomes and potential reactions. She weighed emotional resonance against perception management and calculated timing and phrasing with meticulous care. Thomas recalls thinking that this was not mere imagination, it was rehearsal. It was practice for real-life encounters that would eventually carry significant social and personal consequences. As Thomas delved deeper, he realized that the diaries and emails also provide a roadmap of priorities and values. Meghan frequently reflected on the importance of trust, loyalty, and authenticity, even as she navigated strategic interactions. This balance between ethical reflection and ambition, he notes, is a defining feature of her approach, a combination of heart and calculation that allowed her to form genuine connections while advancing her objectives. Perhaps most strikingly, Thomas discovered entries that directly referenced Prince Harry before they officially met. Notes describing qualities she sought in a partner: visibility, empathy, adaptability, and a capacity for public scrutiny, align uncannily with Harry's real-life attributes. Thomas reflects that while coincidences happen, the consistency of these patterns across years, combined with strategic actions in Hollywood and social circles, suggests careful anticipation and readiness for opportunity. And as Thomas closed the last folder in this deep dive, he felt the weight of what he had uncovered. The diaries and emails were more than personal reflections. They were evidence of foresight, ambition, and methodical planning spanning decades. Childhood fascination, Hollywood networking, and early reflections now converged into a coherent narrative, one of deliberate preparation, strategic thinking, and a keen awareness of opportunity. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when secrets you never imagined suddenly land on the desk of one of the world's oldest institutions? For Thomas Markle, the revelation of Meghan's diaries and emails wasn't just personal. It had ramifications that reached the highest corridors of Buckingham Palace. The documents hinted at ambition, foresight, and strategy so precise that they challenged not only public perception of Meghan, but also the royal family's understanding of the path that had brought her into their midst. Thomas recalls the moment he first realized the potential impact. The diaries weren't merely private musings. They contained references to social positioning, careful observation of influential figures, and a calculated awareness of how relationships could be leveraged. Every email, every note, and every reflection painted a picture of someone who had thought decades ahead, mapping out steps that would eventually intersect with Harry's life. The gravity of this realization hit Thomas with full force. If made public, these materials could reshape narratives, spark controversy, and potentially create tension inside the palace itself. The reaction within Buckingham Palace, Thomas learned through indirect sources and trusted contacts, was immediate and intense. Advisors reportedly held emergency meetings to assess the situation. Security protocols were reviewed, public statements were considered, and internal discussions debated the potential fallout. Sources close to the royal household described a tense atmosphere, with aides and advisors grappling with the implications of a private history coming to light. Thomas recalls feeling a mix of satisfaction and trepidation. The evidence he held was powerful, yet he knew it would not be received quietly. What struck Thomas most was how seriously the palace seemed to take these revelations. The focus was not simply on the content itself, but on what it implied about public perception, the media narrative, and the broader implications for royal protocol. According to Thomas, there was concern that if the diaries and emails were analyzed publicly, the story would challenge decades of tradition, expectations, and carefully curated narratives. Even seemingly small details, phrases in a diary, a carefully worded email, were being scrutinized for their potential to influence opinion both inside and outside the monarchy. Thomas also notes that the palace was reportedly concerned about the timing. Meghan and Harry were highly visible figures, engaged in numerous public initiatives and projects. Any disclosure of past documents could create a media storm, overshadowing current activities and putting additional strain on the couple. Thomas reflects that this awareness underscores how seriously the royal household treats both public perception and the management of personal narratives. The mere potential for controversy was enough to set alarm bells ringing. The documents themselves were remarkably detailed. Thomas recalls emails that described social dynamics, hypothetical scenarios, and strategic approaches to events and relationships. Diaries contained observations of people, reflections on social hierarchies, and notes on how best to navigate complex interactions. Even small details, like timing of conversations or tone of delivery, were meticulously recorded. Thomas explains that for Buckingham Palace, the very existence of such documents was startling. They suggested foresight, planning, and strategic awareness that few expected outside the immediate inner circle of the royal family. Sources indicate that the palace reacted cautiously, understanding that premature public commentary could exacerbate the situation. Advisors reportedly debated whether to intervene privately with Thomas, whether to issue statements, or simply to observe and wait. The documents were treated as sensitive, potentially explosive, and requiring careful consideration. Thomas reflects that he was aware of the delicate balance. The revelations were powerful, but handling them incorrectly could provoke backlash or misunderstandings. Even more striking, Thomas says, was the acknowledgement within the palace that these revelations could alter perceptions of Harry's agency in his own life. The diaries and emails suggested that Meghan's ambitions were long-standing, meticulously considered, and strategically executed. For those inside Buckingham, this raised questions. Was Harry fully aware of the scope of these ambitions? How much agency did he have in the unfolding narrative? And what would the public infer if these documents became widely known? The questions were delicate, complex, and fraught with potential consequences. Thomas also highlights that the documents revealed both continuity and foresight. Childhood reflections, Hollywood networking strategies, and early interactions with Harry all demonstrated consistent planning and awareness. To the palace, this suggested a coherent, long-term trajectory, a life mapped with attention to opportunity, influence, and timing. Thomas recalls that this realization added urgency to the palace's deliberations. The implications were not only personal for Meghan and Harry, but institutional, affecting perceptions of protocol, precedence, and public expectation. Interestingly, Thomas notes, the palace's response included both curiosity and caution. Some advisors were reportedly fascinated by the insight into Meghan's mindset, while others were concerned about the potential for public controversy. The documents challenged assumptions, prompting internal discussions about preparedness, media strategy, and engagement with the public. Even minor excerpts, once leaked or reported, could spark narratives questioning authenticity, motivation, and character, making every line of text a potential trigger for debate. Thomas also emphasizes that this period revealed the human side of the institution. While Buckingham Palace is often seen as formal, distant, and controlled, the reaction to these revelations highlighted sensitivity, concern, and a desire to maintain harmony. Advisors, aides, and even members of the inner circle were acutely aware of the interplay between private history and public perception. Thomas describes this awareness as both surprising and instructive. Even the most insulated institutions must navigate the unpredictable impact of personal revelations in the age of global media scrutiny. And yet, despite all precautions, Thomas understood that the mere existence of the diaries and emails was enough to create ripple effects. The documents weren't just personal reflections, they were evidence of foresight, planning, and strategy applied over decades. Their disclosure, intentional or accidental, could provoke controversy, debate, and reevaluation of long-held assumptions about Meghan, Harry, and their place within the monarchy. The stakes were enormous, the sensitivity acute, and the potential consequences unpredictable. Thomas recalls an instance where a close contact described the mood inside the palace as one of quiet alarm. Advisors debated scenarios, potential responses, and ways to mitigate public fallout. Every word of the diaries and emails was scrutinized, analyzed, and weighed for its impact on both the family and the broader institution. Thomas, observing from the outside, marveled at the intensity of the reaction. He realized that what he held in his hands was more than personal. It was institutional, and it carried weight far beyond anything he had imagined. And then, as Thomas continued reviewing the documents and reflecting on the palace's response, he uncovered an entry that would change everything yet again. A note that suggested awareness, not only of influence and ambition, but of potential leverage over perception itself. This single entry, he recalls, crystallized the realization